record. Okay. All right, does everybody see the consent to record, I hope? Great. All right, so more and more people are coming, which is amazing, but I do want to get started because time is precious. I want to welcome Dr. Barbara Brown to the room tonight, to our school. Dr. Brown has been just such an amazing gift to me as a partner these past few months, thinking about what is the implication of the Heath family legacy on our school, what is an amazing thought partner to myself, to others, and has been really, for Brookline, I think, a gift in making invisible history quite visible. I don't want to say much more because I think what you'll see tonight from Dr. Brown is really just tells the story of her passion of this work around, again, making the invisible quite visible. And then helping us all kind of be illuminated in who we are as members of this community in both the public schools of Brookline and then the town of Brookline. And so I want to welcome Dr. Brown to the table. I also have a slide deck here, so I will be sharing that slide deck right now. So just to give me a minute, but Dr. Brown, while I'm doing this, please feel free to start talking.
Well, I'll start by saying that my children were the third generation in the family to go to the Brookline schools, starting with my husband's father. They went to Pierce School. My husband's father went to what is now the Ridley School. So I feel connected both through schools as well as just from living here. I want to start, though, by saying that a lot of people approach the notion of slavery, not the notion, the reality of slavery in our country, with dread, with uncomfortableness, and I do too sometimes. But tonight I'm approaching it with a certain amount of gladness because I'm doing it together with you, and together we are creating from the ground up a new way of looking at our history. And history is not only top down from scholars, but also from the ground up of what people discover. And we can discover that and deal with it in our own ways, decide what's important. And so I'm happy to be here, actually. I'm not here because, oh, I gotta talk about this. I'm talking about this because this is exciting history, bringing it forward, bringing it into the public. And the scholars have been working on this in the last 20 years in very exciting ways here in Massachusetts. So I'm benefiting from them as well. So let's get started, and let's begin with the next slide, as every town meeting begins. And that is beginning with an acknowledgement next of that this was the land of the Massachusetts people. And I'll give you a chance to read a portion of what is read at every town meeting. Before I go on,
for those of us who are driving, is it possible to read that out loud?
I'm happy to do that. Great. I will read that loud. Yep. Land and more acknowledgement. As town meeting members, let us take a moment to acknowledge the history of this land we call Brookline. This is the unceded land of the Massachusetts people, whose traditions, language, and stewardship continue today. Today, we are living on land that was taken by force. Lives were also stolen. During King Philip's War, 7 indigenous men were sold into slavery in the Caribbean by residents. Slavery grew. Soon, those enslaved were of African descent. We benefit from these systems. Thus, we dedicate ourselves to addressing them today.
Thanks, Asa. I will add one more thing, and this is from within the Heath School District. there was a cemetery of the Massachusetts people here in what we call Brookline. And they used to come back to Brookline when they were no longer able to live here to visit the cemetery, to visit their ancestors. And that cemetery was near Reservoir Lane. So there's a presentness to it as well. To the next slide, please. Now, I want you to do how this Hidden Brookline got started, which was things hidden in plain view. How many of you have walked into town hall? Could you raise your hands? Okay, a lot of people. You probably never paid any attention to this plaque except to say, that's a lovely looking plaque, and it is. Now it's your turn to do what I was asked to do 16 years ago, to look more closely at the plaque, and you will have a closer up, and find the names of 3 enslaved men who marched to the Battle of Lexington from Brookline. And when you find their names, if you would write them in the chat. And for those who are driving, I'm sorry, you'll just have to go over to Town Hall yourself and to take a look for those names. Next slide, please. And Asa, oh, and if you've done this exercise before, perhaps you've come on a walking tour, don't say anything in the chat. Leave it to the people who are new to this. And Asa, I can't see the chat. Oh, there, I see the chat. Good.
So far, I do not see anybody in the chat.
I'll give you some more time. Yeah. 3rd graders get more time, as do the 8th graders and the adults. Mm-hmm. And it's harder to put a name in the chat because that's more than coming over to the back of the hall and whispering a name in my ear and I'm telling you yes or no. Mm-hmm. So you're going to have to take a little bit of risk here. Let's see what we've got in the chat right now.
I see some.
Yes, we have one. S from Tatiana. Is that Tatiana Cruz? Anyway, we have. Okay, thank you, Tatiana. We have Esquire Gardner's Adam, Esquire White's Peter, and then right near them, Esquire Boylston Prince, down at the bottom. Now, what I would like you to do is to tell me the 3 different ways that you can tell that they're enslaved. And put that in the chat too. Mm-hmm. Possessive apostrophe, yep. Something else. That's property notion, yep. No last names, that's a good second one. There's a third one, the way you can tell. Esquire refers to the owner. Esquire is kind of like the esquires in Robin Hood. It means a man of a certain standing with the government, not necessarily a lawyer. Okay, there's one more, and I won't spend time here, but the 3rd one is probably too obvious, and that is that their names are at the bottom. And with the 3rd graders, of course, it's a good time to talk about possessives and possessions. Now, so these are names that are hidden, and they're hidden in plain sight. There are other things that are known, but are not in plain sight. Now think of this. This is the Battle of Lexington. This is 1775. When we talk about the Battle of Lexington, or we talk about April 19th, does anyone ever think how many enslaved people fought at that battle? No. And people did, not just from Brookline, but from other towns. The other thing that happened about then was we have the Freedom Trail taking us back to that time period. Notice the word freedom. This was at the same time, 1775, 1776, 1777, when there were slaves in Massachusetts, across Massachusetts. And yet there's no acknowledgement of them. They're hidden. And then think about Faneuil Hall. How many of you have been to Faneuil Hall? Just raise your hands. Yeah, Faneuil Hall, it's often referred to as the cradle of liberty. It is only next year or maybe the year after that Faneuil Hall has decided that they will have an exhibit on Peter Faneuil as a slave trader. So it's not just a place of freedom, it's also a place of slavery and of the worst kind of the slave traders. So what we're having to do is we're having to take this period of American history and go, it's more complicated than I thought. And slavery was not just in the South. Tell me if a couple of you could put in the chat when you first learned, if it was before tonight, when you first learned that there was slavery in Massachusetts. High school, middle school. Phyllis Wheatley, So a couple of names. I only learned, besides Phyllis Wheatley and Crispus Attucks, about how widespread it was 15 years ago when I started on this work. And it was because of these three names and because I kept on finding more and more names in Brookline. And then I found that in Boston, I learned from a scholar that in Boston in the mid 1700s, 12%, maybe 15% of Boston were enslaved. 12 to 15%. I mean, it's just like, where was that history when I needed to include it? And every single colony was a slave colony. And Massachusetts has the distinction, the awful distinction in 1641 of being the first colony of the 13 to put slavery into law. Before South Carolina, before Virginia, before anyone else. So slavery is embedded, and it was in 1630s, maybe even the 1620s that the first enslaved people arrived in Boston. We need to, like the Brookline High School students, I feel I've been lied to. Some of you are younger, probably most of you are younger, so maybe you haven't been lied to the way I feel I have been. But that's been true about so much of my history, especially about African-American history, especially after George Floyd. So I'm not saying this is a surprise in some sense, but it's an area that we need to pay attention to. Now, what happened to the three men? Next slide, please. There are the three things close up. Now we want to get the next slide. Prince, who fought at the Battle of Lexington, whom you saw on the plaque, he decided he too wanted his independence. And he fled Brookline. And he was able to escape, probably because he went to, he probably went to Salem. And when he went to Salem, he wasn't close to where anybody recognized him. And in Salem, he could get on ship. And once you're offshore, you can't be caught. The trouble with being on a ship in those days, in the mid 1700s, late 1700s, was life expectancy was about 7 years. So he got freedom, and there were other people, African Americans, who were also probably on that ship, and he was with other people who were also free, but it was a hard freedom to get. You'll notice that in this ad, it says that he's about 27, he's 5 feet 2 inches, had men's clothes on. That's so that you could try and recognize him. because Joshua Boylston was dead serious about about finding him. There's also a penalty if you don't turn him in. And then finally, let me tell you about Joshua Boylston. You know, Boylston Street, named after him. And I just discovered that Joshua Boylston bought a 2-year-old or thereabouts when Joshua Boylston was an enslaver. On to, the other 2 men, we know nothing about them. Adam, we know that he's buried in a cemetery in the Potter's Field, but we know nothing else. And Peter, we know nothing at all. It's just one day, and we know so much about the whites who lived in Brookline then. Now on to the next slide. I created this map a number of years ago as I was just noticing how many names there were on the map that were the names of enslavers. And you will not find the Heath family names on it, because at this time, this is before John Heath and Susanna moved into Brookline. At this time, the land was held by Samuel White. My husband has done a look at the map, and all of Samuel White's properties, of which there were about 6, in what you might call the middle district of Brookline. If you're trying to figure out which way this map is going, if you head to the right on the map, you're heading into Boston. If you head to the north on the map, if you will, you're heading towards Cambridge. You're also heading towards Newton if you're heading to the west of the map. So the part that's closest to Boston was the earliest settled, had the largest properties, and so is the ones with the most likely to have enslavers. In Brookline, next slide. There were about 90 enslaved people. This is only part of the list, because if you saw the whole list, you wouldn't see the names. And you can find the whole list on our website, and I'll give you the link in a moment. It's Hidden Brookline. Just Google Hidden Brookline and you'll find it. The enslaved people, usually it was their enslavers who gave them their names. Sometimes they would even give them a new name if they'd had another name before. There was a man named Onesimus in Boston whose name changed when he was bought by a new person. Now, I want to talk about the lives of the enslaved. So let's go on to the next slide. This is a petition, part of a petition that enslaved people made to the state legislature in 1773. This is a thing that could not be done in the South. So slavery was different in the North. You could petition, but you couldn't free yourself. You couldn't become free. They said, we have no property. We have no wives. We have no children. We have no country. And they meant that literally, because the enslavers had bought people and the enslaved traders had brought them for money reasons. And what the enslavers wanted was labor. And the kind of labor that they wanted in Massachusetts was farm labor, woodlot labor, building of ships, and that's male labor pretty much. And then they wanted some domestic labor. As a result, there were twice as many men as women who were enslaved in Massachusetts, and there were almost no children, because you didn't want to have a baby or a small child who would provide no work and would distract the mother or the father. What this meant is that that there was an extraordinary level of loneliness here among the enslaved, particularly as it would often be just one enslaved person in a family, in a white family. And if that were the case, then they would be sleeping on the floor of the kitchen. So lives were systematically warped in a way that was different from the South. I'm not saying it's better. I'm not saying it's worse. I'm just saying it was different. Let's go on to the next slide. Now, what are these plantation style homes doing in Brookline? The one on the right is still standing. The one on the left has been torn down. Who would think to have a plantation style home? If you've got an idea, put it in the chat. No ideas so far, so I'll give you the secret with the next slide. Thomas Perkins, slave trader. That was his house on the left. Let's go back and take a quick look at his house. That was his house on the left that he did in the style of a Santo Domingo plantation, which is where his brother worked. His brother owned the house on the right, buying slaves as they came in from Africa and then reselling them in the north and further across in all of the colonies. On to Perkins. Perkins became extraordinarily wealthy. He was referred to as the merchant prince of Boston. He was a slave trader. And then he discovered there was an opening in China to sell opium. The Chinese emperor forbid it, but the British insisted because it was a way to make a whale of a lot of money. So he was the Sackler family of the United States. And he made a lot of money there. And then after he retired, he became a philanthropist with his earnings from the slave trade and from opium. And he was a particular philanthropist for the school that then became renamed after him, the Perkins School for the Blind. They have on their website about a piece about their founders. And there it says that Thomas Perkins was an extraordinarily generous man who loved mankind. They have not yet reckoned with his history. So that reckoning may be coming. How and what they will decide to do is up to them, of course. But I hope people will be able to encourage them to start thinking about that. So now on to we had 4 slave traders in Brookline, among whom was Senator George Cabot, who was one of our first senators from Massachusetts. And the wealth from slavery would often get passed down, would be inherited. So we have Senator Henry Cabot Lodge, and then in the 20th century, we had Senator Henry Cabot Lodge Jr., who then became ambassador to Vietnam during the Vietnam War. The 2 lodges were Republicans. I don't know what Cabot was. I think he was a Federalist, but I can't be sure. He was a free trade man in any case. And he got legislation passed in 1795 to force the return of fugitive slaves nationally. So but it's not just their money, it's their influence. When you're as wealthy as Senator George Cabot, you travel in a certain circle where you meet other wealthy people who may invite you into a business, or you find out about a business, or you've got the money that you can use to invest in that. As Perkins had the money to invest in more ships in order to join in the opium trade that he'd gotten from the slave trade. He'd also inherited some of it from his mother. So that's part of what we've been hearing about in the last few years about the wealth gap between Blacks and whites in this country. And part of it some small part of it comes from the slave trade and from slavery. Now I want to turn to a next section, and this is community education. We can't do anything. We can't respond to racism unless we know what has happened. And so community education is essential for any form of restorative justice. And community education is really at the foundation of what Hidden Brookline does. And I'll point you to 3 things that we have done. Next. We have taken part, we were not the leaders, we have taken part in the changing of the Edward Devotion name to the Florida Ruffin Ridley name. And part of the challenge of that name was that no one had ever heard of Florida Ruffin Ridley before. And yet she was a national African-American figure who, with her mother, was the co-publisher and co-editor of the first newspaper for African-American women. Together with her mother and 2 other people, she founded the first national organization of African-American women. She was a Harlem Renaissance writer. She lived in Brookline for 20-some years. She raised her children here. And none of us had heard of her. Again, this is more hidden history. And you in the school may find more hidden history and bring it to me, which would be great, because I gotta tell you, I'm always learning new things. My learning has not stopped, and I'm 75. Let's go on to the next slide. We lead walking tours, both for students and for adults. These are 4th grade classes. One of them you can see is in front of the plaque. The other one is in front of one of the 3 Underground Railroad houses that was in Brookline. We have a tour scheduled for this month, but it's already full. Our next scheduled walking tour is May 14th. I think it's a Saturday, but I'm not sure, 1 to 2:30. Next slide, please. And this is the main part of our website. So you can find an awful lot more. There's a bit about the Heath family there on the right side, number 3 down. And about other parts. There is by no means have we finished the website. We just keep on adding material. And I invite you to take a look, or students may be interested in taking a look. Brookline High School senior started working on it with me on the website last year, and she continues to work on it in college. And she is absolutely fabulous. That's Gabriella Myers, I forget her 3rd name. Anyway, from a Colombian family. So on to the final section, which is about the Heaths, the family, the enslaved, and the school. On to the next, please. This is the house of that John Heath had built for his son, Ebenezer. The house was built in 1790 on the occasion of Ebenezer Heath's wedding. And what a wedding it was. It went on for days. John Heath's house was still there. It was right next door. So we have to imagine a building that is no longer here. This house has remained in the family for over 120 years. I don't know if it is still in the family. His son, Ebenezer's son's Charles' house is no longer in the family. And that too was a stone's throw from the other 2 houses. So they built their houses together on family land, on one of 6 pieces of property. Let's see. Let's go on to the next slide. And now here are the people that the Heaths enslaved. And I want to say their names out loud because they have been overlooked. Cuff, Toby, Catherine Hill, Jeremiah, also known as Jerry, Lemon, Jethro Cuff, and Dinah. And then there was another enslaved man named Primus. As you can guess that some names such as Primus and Lemon, and perhaps the other names as well, were names chosen by the owners. For Primus, they wanted to show how cultured they were in classics. And so they used a Latin name, and they also used a slightly mocking name by saying he's the first. But let me tell you about Cuff. Oh, and Cuff's name actually is a Ghanaian name, as in Kofi Annan, who was the Secretary General of the United Nations a few years back. So we kept in an African name, and Toby is also a West African name. We have a couple here, Cuff and Catherine. When I put husband and wife in quotes, there are no records of them being married in Brookline, but perhaps they had married in another town before they came to Brookline. We have no records of that at this point. But they were seen as a couple, and when Cuff died, Catherine was referred to as his widow, which indicates some form of recognized marriage. They both had last names, which was extraordinarily unusual and indicated that they had been able to assert their adulthood in a town where just about every other enslaved person had no last name, as someone remarked when we had the names of the people who marched to Lexington. And they were the one of two couples in Brookline who had a family, who had children. And they were the only family in Brookline where they all lived together, only family of the enslaved. Of their 4 children, 2 lived to full adulthood, and 2, we don't know what happened. Since they don't appear in the death records, and the town death records are pretty comprehensive, including enslaved people, I'm afraid to assume, but it's likely that they were sold away. Primus. Oh, and when the person who lived the longest in the family was Catherine. She lived until 1792. And at that point, she was enslaved to Ebenezer Heath because he had taken over his father's property in 1789. And there's a document in Historical Society that attests to that. When she died of smallpox, which, if you don't know, is an extremely painful disease to die from. And she had no one in her family with her when she died. Primus was there, and so perhaps he helped, and perhaps the owners helped. But it was a lonely existence. My guess is it was fairly lonely when she died. Now she was buried in the cemetery. It's not clear how many people were buried in the family tomb, or if they were buried in the potter's field. The records are ambiguous there. Now let me tell you about Primus. As you can imagine, to be able to keep your manhood or womanhood as an enslaved person was very difficult. And some people found ways to demonstrate that to owners, but they had to do it very carefully. Primus was one of those. When Primus was in the room where John Heath was entertaining a visitor, John Heath apparently liked to tease Primus, to make fun of him, to make fun of his intelligence. So he asked Primus when this visitor was there, he said, "Primus, which is heavier, a pound of feathers or a pound of lead?" Now, probably all of us know that little riddle. Primus fell right into it. And he said, "Well, a pound of lead." And the 2 men laughed at him. It is said, and this is from the whites, that Primus paused. And then he said, "Massa, if you put your head in the fireplace, and I was standing on the roof by the chimney and dropped both the lead and the feathers down, which would you feel more heavily? He probably said it with a bit of a smile and a bit of a, like, this is a funny joke, because he couldn't risk insulting his owner, but he did manage to stand up for himself. And for that, I'm grateful for the story, because we have so few stories of the enslaved. So he had a certain amount of resilience in his life. And now I want to turn to the last section about the Heath School. The Heath School district includes all of the different pieces of lands that the Heath family owned. They would buy up one piece of land and then another piece. They were all fairly close to each other. And the school's current location is on the border of the Heath lands, of the Heath School District. So all of that is within the family. Now let me tell you about how the school got its name. In 1745, think of this, in the middle of colonial days, Brookline decided to have a third school. And that third school was called, what is it called? The Middle District School. Just a location name, a geographic name. At the time in 1745, there were no names for roads. In the 1840s, the town decided to make sure all of its roads had names. And they decided that the road that went past the Heath family home would be called Heath Street. And then a few years later, the school changed its name to the Middle District School on Heath Street. And then a few years, decades later, the school simply shortened its name to the Heath School. The Heath family felt a personal connection to the school in the 19th century, when it was a fairly remote part of town. The teachers would board with the Heath family, and the Heath family, according to their own records, diaries and so forth, enjoyed having these teachers stay. And the children enjoyed a few more adults in the house that they could talk to, and they were probably their own teachers. The Heath family also had a tree planted in front of the school at one point. So what you've got here is a little bit different than what you have with Edward Devotion and the Devotion School. The school was named, got its Heath School name in the 1840s, about 40 years or 45 years after slavery had ended in Massachusetts. But it was named for the Heath family. And the earlier members of the Heath family were enslavers. And that's what I mean by it's a little bit different. And that I leave to you at the school. You have the right, and you have, this is what I mean by creating history. To create the history, to decide what is important and what matters and how it's connected. I feel I have no right to do that. I can provide you with information, but I have no right more than anybody else. And that is where I would like to stop, to encourage discussion, questions, comments. People who say, but wait a minute, what about? So feel free to put all of that, and I'll leave it to Asa to moderate it, either through the chat or through people raising your hands. Go for it, Asa, and welcome everybody.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Barbara. That was really important. And so thank you. I am interested in hearing questions that have come up for you. And please either raise your hand, or we'll give a few minutes, or half a minute, 1 minute, for people to throw in some questions into the chat. You know, some thinking time, just like we give to our third graders.
I see in the chat. Shall I start with the question in the chat? Someone wanted to know more about devotion school history. I'll give you the quick and dirty, not dirty, and it's also on our website under the phrase controversy over a school's name. We had on our website that Edward Devotion's probate and his will, and in his probate it lists one Negro valued at 3 times the value of a cow. And at one day, about 4 years ago, Deborah Brown was trolling around the internet in Brookline and discovered that this school had been named after an enslaver. And she and the former head of the devotion school PTO went to the school committee to ask for them to consider the issue of whether or not to keep the name. The school committee did not respond, and so they took it public, and the Boston Globe came out with an editorial saying that Brookline should change the name of the school. And that created a firestorm. And it was, in some sense, a really good firestorm because that meant that everybody, not only in that school, but in town, had to decide how much slavery matters today. And that was a process that went on. And at some point, the school committee, together with the devotion school leadership, decided that once they had decided to change the name, they put in a place name, Coolidge Corner School, that the students should be involved in choosing the new name since it was their school. And so a group of students was chosen by lottery in a very unusual, fair way. And they sifted through 115 names. And they brought it down to 15, and they presented those 15 names to the public for public comment. Well, that was another firestorm. Because they'd added restorative justice to the standard criteria of person of good standing, a person who is well known, preferably a person from Brookline. And people did not know about half of the names, which was part of our history. And so there was all of this learning going on, and then a decision was made by the school committee and supported by the students to name it the Florida Rough and Ridley. And then the town meeting voted on it and voted overwhelmingly for the name change.
And Deepa, you asked that question. I see that Dave Gayshot put in a link to the Hidden Brookline page about the history of the Edward Devotion School and how the name came about, to begin with, all of those many, many, many decades ago. So check that out. Another question we had was, I think, clarified by another participant about some of the question was, could you repeat what happened to the children, some of the 4 children? This is a Heath teacher who missed that part. You thought they might have been sold, or why did you think that?
2 of the children, one child lived to 21, child lived to be 23, which means that they were both fully engaged as labor. Usually when a child turned 11, they were considered old enough to work full time. And that's when several children were bought and brought into Brookline at the age of 11. I can't remember what they died of. I think one of them died of smallpox. The other one, I think, died of fever. That is in the church records, which are available online through Harvard University. And then the other 2, we would expect to see them in the records of those who have died. And we have many enslaved people who are in the records of those who've died that are church records that were required to be listed, but they're not there. And so either there was sloppiness or they were sold. And I need to find out how often there was sloppiness. So I put out a query just 2 days ago, hoping to get some feedback. Because there are things we just can't know, or things we don't know much about. which is something actually we should remember. That the recorded history doesn't tell us enough. Just like it didn't tell us enough about women. White women, anyway.
There's another question that just jumped in. Is there any way to know if the Heath family members ever publicly said anything about its slave owning history?
Well, in 1905, a Heath descendant named Mrs. Dolliver gave a talk to the Brookline Historical Publications, and the talk was given at the home of a wealthy Brookliner. And you can find this paper in the Brookline Historical Society. And in it, she describes the time when Susanna and John Heath moved into the house of Susanna's grandfather. And she says, this was a very competent, I'm paraphrasing. Susanna was a very competent woman of her time. She must have been busily getting the house ready with the slaves hurrying this way and that way to clean the house and make it ready for the children. The Heath family, we do know from Heath family records, and that's the only part. There are other parts in her statement, but that's the only part that refers to the enslaved. The Heath, there are some Heath diaries from Heath women, and what the overwhelming impression they give is how much the family enjoyed parties. Parties of 40 people, parties of 40 people one day and 40 people the next day coming to tea. And the only way you can serve food, and she talked about the food that was served to that many people, is if you have servants. They did not have servants. They had enslaved people. And then it's unclear. Slavery was never abolished in Massachusetts. It dribbled away for a couple of reasons around 1790, 1800. If you look at the census records for the Heath family after 1800, you'll find several, and they do people by color for a number of years in the census. You find several African Americans listed as workers, and you don't know if they're workers who were paid or workers who were unpaid. And that's just something we have to live with. In Brookline overall, the population of Black people dropped enormously after 1800. People went into Boston, and sometimes people were discouraged from living here because people didn't want free Blacks around. They were afraid. They didn't trust them. And that's not information I have from Brookline. The only information I have from Brookline is the drop in the numbers. It's information from other towns like Concord, where you have the town passing a town law saying that following people are ruled to no longer be welcome in the town. And then they would list African Americans.
Eli, I see your hand is raised.
Thank you. Thank you for the presentation. I did hear you, Barbara. I heard your presentation to the Cambridge Society too, and I appreciate it all. You're definitely helped me put a lot of this in perspective. And so maybe this is a question for you, but maybe it's for the community more generally. I'm just trying to understand if we decide to change the name of Heath, that we're not comfortable with the name for a lot of the reasons that you've kind of shared with us. Like how should we think about other things like the name of Boylston Street or the name of Heath Street? Or, you know, I can imagine if we understood the history better, we would see these names all across our town. And I just don't know how to think about that. So I'm just trying to get some perspective on, thinking about that.
I think about it in one way, and it might not, and I know of other people who don't think about it in the same way. There are people in this town who want to change Washington Street as soon as possible. For me, I want to change the names that are Brookline names or Boston area names. That's my priority, because that's the thing that hits you more in the gut. Joshua Boylston lived here, and yet he is honored with a huge road. But the other street names are problematic because, for example, in the Aspinwall family, there are Aspinwalls who were enslavers, and there are Aspinwalls who later were against slavery. So who is the Aspinwall Street named after? If someone did the research and found that the name was at such and such a date, but the street names in general weren't until the 1840s, which is well after slavery ended. So it's difficult. But we do know that Boylston Street was named after Joshua Boylston. Heath Street, again, that's got both Heaths who were enslavers and Heaths who were not. And yeah. And you know that house that I showed you in the picture, when you look at that house, which is on Heath Street, and the other house is on Heath Hill, the first house on Heath Hill, right next to Heath Street, the beginning of Heath Street, it looks like it could have been built in the 1920s as a pseudo-colonial house, but it's not a pseudo-colonial house. It is a colonial house. And he inherited his father's wealth. So I don't have an answer. And again, I leave that to and I'd be happy to be part of a community discussion, but I leave that to a community discussion. And thanks for asking the hard question, Eli.
I also hear that a lot, like I heard it from kids when we've been talking about this in school. Oh no, I live right at the corner of Heath Street. What should I do? Or I have lots of spirit wear. What should I do? And really just talk about how, we can make the smarter we are about what our role is in this complicated history, what the complicated history is, and we're able more and more to ask good questions, and we can start to find complex answers. And
the discussion itself is worth something. It's not just, let's find a solution.
Right.
Let's find an answer. But the discussion will challenge each one of us. As I said, a friend and colleague of mine thinks Washington Street is the next street to go. I disagree. We haven't yet had a chance to talk about that more.
I see.
And by the way, we're hoping to have a conversation with the Perkins School, but a conversation, not a demand.
I see Deepa's hand, and then Dave, I see your hand. So Deepa.
You're muted.
Thank you, Barbara. That was very interesting history. And thanks, Eli, for bringing up the question, because I think, I think there's a risk of going down a slippery slope of trying to change history and trying to change how things came about instead of learning about them and learning what not to do for the kids. And this was meant to be a discussion. I think when Asa first brought it up, it was supposed to be a discussion that the whole community would have. But my understanding from talking to the kids is it's kind of a done deal. And that's what the little ones think. And they've already said, it's going to happen. It's going to happen in the fall. I'll be in such and such a grade at the time. And that's a little disturbing because I don't think we've had a chance to really hear, all of this and discuss it. And these aren't, it's one thing for children to get on the bandwagon and try to change your name. I was a Heath alum. I'm proud to be a Heath alum. And I think, some of this, hearing some of this history is disturbing, but it was a disturbing time. I mean, our history is a disturbing time. We can't erase it. We can maybe not allow that to happen again. I think teaching about the history to adults and kids and the community is very important. But where, at what point do we start or stop changing names and taking down buildings and taking down statues and all this stuff? So I think these are tricky. It's a tricky thing. And we do risk, in our society right now with COVID and all that, I think there's so much rift in society, and this is not creating peace. It's just, it's I think unearthing to learn from it is important, but I just think one has to tread carefully. Thank you.
Thank you. Dave.
I was just going to share a thought, and first, huge thank you, Barbara, for the very informative presentation and for helping us think through this. To Eli's really good question, I was going to share the thought that for others to consider and push back on if you want, is that thinking about why people or individuals or families are honored with naming of whether it be a school or a street or something else is really important. Not just it's not an all or nothing question, right? In the case of Edward Devotion, it was because he left money to the town. And part of the way he accumulated that money was on the back of someone that or potentially multiple someones that he forced to labor for him without being paid. And so he donated something. He was recognized for donating something that ultimately, one could argue, I think quite compellingly, wasn't really his. And so in the case of we have something of a similar situation potentially with the Heaths, where the reason why the street became named Heath and then the school became named Heath was because ultimately of money and property. It wasn't because of any significant civic contribution, I think, that we're aware of. It was because those were people who owned a lot of land and had a lot of wealth at the time. And if, some or all of that wealth was able to be generated, maintained, passed along because of the fact that people were enslaved to and weren't paid for their labor and weren't free to leave, that seems like a relevant factor. Now, you've got some of that same issue with Washington's the example that was named, but the reason why there's a Washington Street in Brookline is not because George Washington was a major landowner in Virginia. It was because George Washington, while he had those very, very real, concerns about the way that he and his family lived, also did very, historically important things from a political and, perspective for our country. Those two things can live in tension, right? And the reason why things are named after Washington or Jefferson are not just because they were rich people who owned a lot of things and happened to own part of that on the backs of enslaved people. Whereas with Devotion and to some extent, at least it seems with the Heaths, the only claim to fame is, rich people who owned a lot of things. And so maybe that's a distinction we could draw.
Thank you, Dave. I see Allison.
I don't have a lot to say, but beyond, thank you, Barbara, as well for the presentation. It's very sobering, very good to know. I just wanted to offer one thing that I talked to my students about when I used to work at Ruff and Ridley while they were going through this process. I had students who brought up that same point of like, okay, so, and it wasn't necessarily trying to shut the conversation down. It was curiosity, like, do we change these other names of other places now? Because we know about Washington, we know about, I don't think they brought up Boylston, but that's a good thing to bring to know about as well. And one thing that I said to them that I just think like helped me, like, because it's such a good question, was that, we are this school and we are considering what matters to us in this school, and we're considering our spheres of control, our spheres of influence, and some things that are beyond our control. But just because there are these larger conversations doesn't mean we can't look inward at what we are and what we stand for and what our school name is. And so that, I don't think it answers the question, but it's one thing that we kind of came to as a group over there.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I gotta say, everything I've listened to has been really helpful.
Mhm. Agreed.
And I see Asa nodding too. Yeah.
Yeah. Tatiana.
I agree with Dave and with Allison in their thoughts about this. And I do think that, I mean, I've been a Heath for 21 years and I did not know this history, and I was a proud Heath teacher and continue to be. But now that I do know the history, it does change how I feel when I wear my vest that says Heath on it or my sweatshirt that says Heath on it, because we are trying to be an upstanding community, an upstanding institution for everybody who comes through our doors. And it feels disingenuous to have a name that honors an enslaver. And it feels like an affront to our students of color to come into a building that is honoring someone who enslaved. And I feel that that's a very, that it's not a nice message. It's not a good, wholesome message to send to all our students. And I think that, and I do say that, I also think that my white students would agree with that, would agree that they don't want to be coming to a building that is named for someone who's enslaved. Or who enslaved, sorry.
Tatiana, what do you teach, or who do you teach? What grade? Or subject?
I teach fourth grade. I teach fourth grade, and we have a lot of conversations about race and identity and a lot of different issues. And you know, we talk a lot about which communities, which people were in charge at different times. Same people, unfortunately, all the time up to this point. And so, you know, we have a lot of conversations about where power lies and why things get named the way they named and why things happen the way they happen.
Can I be a student in your class?
Anytime.
By the way, I am ready and actually eager, enthusiastic to lead a walking tour for any group of 6 or more people, more or less at any time. I'm retired. The walking tours give me great satisfaction and often joy as people discover things and see things, because to go past them, to go into them is pretty special. So you can get in touch with me. Asa, could you put my email in the chat box? And or if there's a class or a group of parents from a particular grade, I'd be glad to do it. Or you want to organize it through the PTO for all the parents, and the first 20 people who sign up get to go. And then I do it again.
All right. I see Margaret, your hand is raised.
Hi, thank you. Yeah, I'm new to Heath this year. My son is in the first grade, but I teach middle school humanities at a school in Quincy. And I think I just want to say, first of all, thank you so much for all of the interesting points and perspectives everybody has raised here. Barbara, for your amazing history, Eli, Dave, Allison, Tatiana, for such great points. And I come to everything as both a parent and a teacher. And I know that my 8th grade students, I'm teaching US history right now, and we happen to be doing this chapter 5, Creating American Identity, and the cover image of that chapter. And I went through different issues not issues, because I happen to, it's a book that's been used a lot, and I've got downloaded PDFs, and I went through different versions, and they change the versions of the painting on that chapter, but it's always white men. Sometimes it's old white men, sometimes they're young men, but it's a chapter about forming American identity. So this is something, you know, I impact with my students, like, because my students are only 48% white at the school where I teach, right? So what is that saying to them? And I had them and an essay about what is America, who is an American, who gets to be an American, what does this mean? It was more of a reflection. And one of my students basically said my assignment was stupid in this incredibly elegant way, and how how are they supposed to answer this? This is an African-American student when, so, and then she unpacked all these different ideas people have about who's an American. It was just amazing. I was blown away. And I think so often I, as a teacher, like the kids know, right? And I think somebody here mentioned about the kids talking about it, and they're already on it. And, you know, my first grade son has come home talking about it. I think they've had such thoughtful conversations. And I think that it is different when it's a school versus Washington Street. And I think it is different when you're talking about General Washington versus just somebody who is a big landowner. Nothing against big landowners, but, you know, where did that money come from, on whose back? These are questions we're all unpacking as a society, and schools are the right places for these conversations to happen. And I think having the kids included in it, I mean, they just feel so much more part of the process, but also it's now known, it's out there, right? So for the kids, what does that say to them if we come back and we're like, well, okay, we know this now. And I can also, you know, I can also say, if I suddenly found out, as somebody whose family experienced some bad things in Europe, if I suddenly found out that somebody who was like, that we're going to name, you know, turns out, oh, it's Himmler school, like that would be really uncomfortable for me. So for me, it's also, if any kid is uncomfortable in the school, I feel like Heath is so about community. I love, as a new parent, the rainbow out front. I love on my tour of the school, all of the representation of all of the different people that make it Heath. But if it's known and it's out there, then there are going to be kids who feel awkward about that. And so, anyway, sorry, that was a little long-winded. I'll go off. I'll mute.
Thank you, Margaret. I want to be cognizant of the time, and I'm looking at the chat. I see, Dave, you just dropped something in the chat. I'll read out loud for those who can't see the chat. Perhaps we could do a Why is Heath School named Heath as part 2 of the walking tour, walking down Heath Street, showing people where Middle District School was, etc. Yeah. I'm also thinking about, in that vein, Dave, working closely with our 8th grade social studies teacher, Andrew Cook. And he and I were talking about other projects that students could start to do, building a Wikipedia page, adding on to the Hidden Brookline tour with some information that's student kind of driven, those kinds of things to really help them feel like stakeholders.
Adding on to putting their own, some voices of students on the Hidden Brookline website would be terrific. I'd want them mediated by adults.
Mm-hmm.
Or curated, how about that, since that's a popular word.
Yes, curated. So yeah, no, I think that's really important, and there's a lot of excitement around doing that kind of productive, helpful work so that we can all kind of move forward in our understandings. So
Just realized I don't know where the Heaths are buried. Oh, wait, of course I know where they're buried. They're buried in the old cemetery. And we should be able to find their tomb, because it was a tomb. Because I have a map of where everyone is buried who isn't buried in the Potter's Field. And that's the last stop on the walking tour.
Eli, I see your hand again.
I know you're trying to wrap us up, but I think, well, Barbara's here. I just wanted to ask the names that the other schools are named after, the people who the other schools in K-8 or around Brookline are named after. Does anyone else have a history that we should be, that kind of, you know, has these same kind of concerns?
Great question. About when the when the controversy came up about devotion's name, the school committee appointed a citizens committee called the Task Force on School Names. And it was the most diverse committee I've ever been on in Brookline, by race, by class, by ethnicity, by age and background. It was a delight. There were about 10 of us, and we looked at all 8 school names. And we particularly looked, of course, at Devotion's name, and we voted it unanimously that his name should be removed. Though no one, until the vote came, no one knew how anybody else was going to vote, because we had the kind of discussion that was, well, what about this and what about that? It was really interesting. Then we flagged the Heath School name, and some people wanted to remove the name to make that public, and other people said, not at this moment. Not at this time. This is not a time to go deeply into the question of the name. And so we left that on the table. And one of the people on the committee, not myself, if I were going to say it was myself, I'd tell you, said, you know, you have to think about inheritance. Actually, Catherine Hill was inherited by 4 different members, 4 different generations in that family, because she lived till 78. And the first generation was not even called Heath. It was her grandparents. So that was left on the table, and there were no other names. I mean, I can tell you something about each one of the other names, and actually they're mostly boring. Somebody was on the school committee for 40 years. So we should name a school after them. That was the first woman. You know, somebody was vice president of MIT. He was on the school committee. Let's name a school after him, William Lincoln. Reverend Pierce, who had an uneasy relationship around race, but came to Brookline after slavery had ended. Had he? I can't remember. Anyway, he was on the school committee for many years. And he was the only minister in town for a while. So that's how names got made. There is one name that's special, and that's the, where is my brain? The school.
Lawrence? Or?
There's one school that's named after a man who worked very hard to end, Amos Lawrence. He was not opposed to slavery, but he was opposed to the extension of slavery. And he gave lots of his money to send people to Kansas so that Kansas would not vote as a slave state.
Great.
That's the only unusual person, other than maybe Reverend Pierce. And I've talked too long.
So Tatiana asks, what are the next steps to continue these conversations? I'll be sending out a save the date for a more kind of less of a presentation, more of a conversation with some guiding questions that we'll be able to have in a few weeks, 7-8 days or so. I'm hopeful. So on Friday, I'll send out a save the date, recording that as well. I think Zoom is a place, even though we could technically meet in person, I think Zoom is a place where a lot of people can just talk from the comfort of their home. So look for that. Continuing to work with our students inside the walls of the school and to send out resources that can help you continue that conversation at home. Working with presenting a timeline for potential next steps. I have a small committee of folks who we meet regularly to find people to sit on panel discussions that we're hoping to have very soon with members of the Florida Ruffin Ridley team and how they went through their name change process and hearing from them directly why that was of value and important in their community so that we can learn lessons that have already kind of been learned and apply them to our own work. And then, so just keeping on having an invitational conversation around this. And, hopefully start to really, for me, a lot of people, I think, Deepa talked about this. I have never said, this is a done deal, but I think that people feel like it's a done deal because we have come to recognize that our school does play an intensely special place in people's hearts and in the lives of our students. And that when we have this understanding, like Tatiana was talking about, that our school is named after a family that enriched themselves for generations through the process and the act of enslaving other human beings, that it makes it really difficult to feel good about all the other, it's not, I mean, we feel good about our work. I feel a tremendous pride in being the principal of Heath School. I think I've got the most amazing team in the district. I think we're the best school in Brookline. Because Brookline's the best, we're the best school in the world, right? I believe all of those things truly. But I also believe that we're capable of having a really complicated conversation about what the name of the school means. And I just believe in us. And I think it's valuable. I think that is a space that, filled with smart, good, capable, passionate people, that we're capable of grappling with something this complicated in a way that makes people in the end feel really good. And so I'm going to continue to keep on building capacity around that kind of visionary conversation, with the outcome that we will eventually need to make a decision and move forward with a renaming of the school process. And that again is based on complex collaborative conversations. And so I hope to continue this with many of you as possible through many different ways. So be looking for those ways. And right now, I just want to say thank you to Barbara. I'm so thankful to you. And I can't wait to have you in front of our kids as an expert, leading our tours as that expert. And I'm afraid we'll wear you out, but I'm thankful for everything you've done for us tonight and
You
continue.
can't wear me out. I'm sorry.
Perfect, great.
But the parents, if the parents want to form a group, a group of parents from like a 4th grade class, I'd be happy to lead a parents group.
Awesome. And I thank everybody here tonight. You took your time to be here. That shows that you're really committed to our school. And for that, I'm eternally very thankful. I see all the names. I'm very proud of your kids too. We love your kids. And again, everything we do in service of them. And so I hope that you know that as you say goodnight tonight, and we'll see you in school very soon. Thanks, everybody.
Night, everybody.
Night.
Thank you for inviting me.
Thank you. Night.
Awesome. Thank you, Barbara.
Thanks, Asa.
I will be in contact soon.
That was a pleasure.
Oh, good. I hope so. All right. Well, good night.
Good night.
See you.